So let's get started with understanding SIBO. SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And I feel like it is one of the most misunderstood conditions that I see in my gastrointestinal practice based on what my patients come in, their sort of conceptions or preconceptions about this. And that's not surprising because I think physicians have a difficult time understanding it too. And I think part of that is because of, let me turn my sound up. I think part of that is because of the name, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So overgrowth suggests that you have too much of something, right? That there's too much bacteria. But SIBO is actually a form of dysbiosis. And dysbiosis refers to the sort of the mothership, right? The overarching concept of bacterial imbalance. So when we talk about bacterial imbalance, oh, thank you, Lee. I am feeling better. Thank you. I think the green smoothies and some rest did the trick, and hopefully the split pea soup I'm making is going to add to that. Thank you for asking. So, okay, this is really the most important concept I want you to understand. Dysbiosis refers to this basic concept of microbiome imbalance or disruption. So it would be like if we have a concept like aging, a wrinkle may be a part of aging, bone loss might be a part of aging, muscle loss may be a part of aging, but the overall thing is aging, right? So the overall thing is dysbiosis. So when we talk about a microbial balance, what are we really talking about? We're talking about a couple things. We're talking about the diversity of gut bacteria. We need lots of different species because they all do lots of different things. And the sad truth is when we look at our microbial diversity in sort of the West, in the more developed world, compared to the diversity, for example, of our brothers and sisters in the Amazon or the Hadza tribe in Tanzania who live a more hunter-gatherer existence, even though of course that existence is being threatened now because of development and fires, etc. But if we look at their microbial diversity, we see that we only have about 2/3 of the species they have. Now, it is a little bit apples and oranges because people who live in different environments have different microbes that are adapted for that environment. But what we generally know is that a wide diversity is good. And we've seen really over the decades that our microbial diversity is we're getting less and less diverse. We're turning into sort of a monoculture in terms of what's going on in our guts. And just like with the land, monoculture is not good for the land. Monoculture is not good for our terrain, for our sort of soil, okay? The other thing that I want you to know is that you have a gradient from the mouth to the anus. The amount of gut bacteria that you have changes. So for example, in the upper GI tract, in the stomach and small intestine, it's certainly not sterile. It's, crawling with microbes, but we have way fewer bacteria in our esophagus and stomach. The first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, the second part of the small intestine, the jejunum, and the third part of the small intestine, the ileum. And as you go from the ileum, the end of the small intestine, to the beginning of the colon, you start to see the amount of bacteria increase. So from all the way at the top in the upper GI tract, all the way down to the bottom, literally our bottom, our rectum and anus, the amount of gut bacteria increases dramatically as you go from north to south. Well, why is that? It's because most of the important bacterial processes of fermentation, remember we've talked about this on other office hours, how these gut bacteria, especially my favorite, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, how they take the indigestible plant fiber and they ferment it and they turn it into these really helpful short chain fatty acids like the butyrate, butyric acid, propionate, etc., propionic acid. That happens, that magic happens in the large intestine, in the colon, lower down in the intestine. So higher up in your digestive tract, you're getting the active process of digestion and absorption of nutrients, right? Food is being broken down into its constituent parts and then transported across the gut membrane into the bloodstream to be carried to all the different cells of your body that are going to utilize that food as energy. And then as we go further down into the colon, digestion isn't happening in the colon. What's happening in the colon is that water, fluid, is being reabsorbed from the lumen of the gut, from the inside of the gut, into the bloodstream. And that's why, when the fecal contents, or the polite way of saying it is the products of digestion, when the products of digestion hit the colon from the small intestine, they're very liquid. It's a green bilious looking liquid. And a lot of that liquid gets reabsorbed through the lining of the colon, and a lot of dead bacteria get dumped into that bilious product of digestion, right? And so you go from kind of a greenish liquid to a more brown formed stool. And that magical process happens in the colon, where most of the gut bacteria are. So when we talk about disrupting the microbiome, we're not just talking about antibiotics. Of course, antibiotics are number one on the list, because the sort of alarming reality is that 5 days of a broad spectrum antibiotic of the kind that you would use to treat a sinus infection, a urinary tract infection, et cetera, 5 days of that can remove up to a third of your gut bacteria. And I'm here to tell you that no amount of probiotic is ever going to put that back exactly how it was, right? The older you are, the more resistant you are to those changes. But depending on what your past background is, you can still, or if you're having, persistent antibiotic use or a prolonged course or multiple courses, one after the other, those can be really problematic. So antibiotics, obviously, number one. We talked about acid blockers a couple of weeks ago, and acid blockers, for those of you who weren't joining us, and for a refresher for those of you who were, the way they mess up your microbiome is they change the pH. The pH of your stomach is acidic, and that means that acid is basically much less hospitable to bacteria as well as viruses. So you don't have as much bacterial growth in the stomach. When you block stomach acid with these proton pump inhibitor drugs and Nexiums and the Prilosec and the pantoprazoles, et cetera, you remove the stomach acid and you now make the stomach alkali. And an alkali environment is a very friendly, hospitable environment that allows a lot of the bacteria to flourish. So that changes things. And in the big study that they did, looking at people taking proton pump inhibitors, they found that they were seeing things were all twisted around. They were seeing like the mouth anaerobes were represented in the rectum. And because when you change that pH of being very acidic in the stomach and less acidic further on is important for maintaining that gradient. Okay. What's another thing that maintains that gradient is motility, gut motility. So if you have ever had the privilege of inserting an endoscope into somebody's intestine, which I have done many thousands of times, one of the things that you see, and I'll see if I can get a video up of this next time, you see the peristaltic waves in the small intestine, and it is really like this, and it's mesmerizing. It's beautiful. You see the little finger-like villi and the waves, and it's really quite gorgeous. And you see that very actively when you do an upper endoscopy. You go through the stomach into the duodenum. And if you go a little further down into the jejunum, especially in a procedure called an enteroscopy, which is a little deeper than a regular endoscopy, you see this peristalsis, and it is very obvious. It is moving things down. But in the colon, we don't have those peristaltic contractions. It's more passive movement. I mean, the colon does move, but not like the small intestine. And so motility is also a really important factor in maintaining that gradient, because with the small intestinal motility and it being very active, it's pushing bacteria down into the colon. Okay. So blocking acid, taking antibiotics and killing off bacteria, and doing things to affect your gut motility. What do we do to affect our gut motility? We sit for long periods of time, right? And like I'm fond of saying, if you're not moving, neither is your digestive tract. So we are sedentary and we are stationary, because I stand a lot. I happen to be sitting today, but even when I'm standing, I'm still stationary. We know movement and exercise stimulates peristalsis. So reduced motility is a huge factor, which is why we see a lot of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, for example, in people in nursing homes, because they're just lying on their backs or sitting all day. So anything that interferes with motility, that can be a drug. So for example, narcotics, any kind of pain medication is going to dramatically slow down gut motility. Huge contributor to SIBO. Benzodiazepines like Valium and Ativan, Xanax, those drugs slow down motility. Some antidepressants slow down motility. Some supplements, if they have iron in it, can slow down motility. So anything that is a potentially sort of constipating effect, but even if it's not constipating in the colon, there's still drugs that affect motility. So you have to think about that. And I'm a huge advocate for taking a careful look at the medicine cabinet and seeing what's going on there, because it is often contributing to the problem. So motility issues, what else can affect motility? Surgery. If you have had a part of your bowel removed and you have an anastomosis, things are sort of rejoined, there can sometimes be a loss of motility. If you have had surgery in another area, you might have had a hysterectomy and had your uterus removed and you have scar tissue that's now impeding the bowel motility. There's certain inflammatory conditions like Crohn's disease. That's one of my diseases that I treat, one of the autoimmune diseases, and Crohn's disease, which can affect any part of the gut, unlike ulcerative colitis, which is just in the colon. A lot of those patients have strictures and thickening of the bowel that affects the motility of the bowel. Diabetes is a huge one. And we now see that, I think we're almost up to 1 in 5 Americans with diabetes or pre-diabetes. So that's a huge one because diabetes can affect the nerves that affect the bowel emptying. And then of course, diet, right? So if we are not eating the right food to help our gut microbes thrive and flourish, that can create problems. So there's this whole long list. And I'll tell you in my second book, The Microbiome Solution, which is sort of all about this, the chapter on messing up the microbiome, dysbiosis, is sort of an exhaustive reference if you're interested with all of these things and all of these associated conditions, et cetera. But why do I say SIBO is misunderstood? Because the focus on overgrowth, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, suggests that the problem is we have too much bacteria, when often what has actually caused a SIBO is undergrowth, is that this person has been on one too many antibiotics, has killed off a lot of their gut bacteria, and now they have regrowth and they have sort of an explosion of the less helpful species. So this happens in a few stages. So the first thing that happens really when you take an antibiotic, for example, or if you're really on a sort of a crummy diet, is you start to see decrease in the normal healthy anaerobes, which are the ones that usually thrive on less oxygen, anaerobes in the gut. And that would be like the lactobacillus and the bifido, right? So you start to see a diminution of those. Second phase, you start to see an increase in colonization with some of what we like to call the pathobionts. These are typically not pathogens. This is not, Mycobacterium tuberculosis or things like that. Typically, these are some staph species, some Campylobacter species, et cetera, that are normally present in the gut, but now they start to grow a little bit out of control. So now they're overrepresented. And that's where the problem starts. So that's phase 2. In phase 3, we start to see not just colonization, but active reproduction. So some of these less helpful, less beneficial species now that started to move into the area are now reproducing. They're really, they're shacking up and they're really taking root in the area. And then in the 4th stage, we see a dramatic decrease in the helpful species. And so it's not just the gut. Remember, it's their metabolites. It's the things they're producing. It's all the activities they're doing. So now it's all mixed up. It's chaotic. It's like I'm turning up at my daughter's school. She's turning up at my office. Nobody knows what they're supposed to do. Although she could probably figure out what she's supposed to do better than I could figure out what I'm supposed to do in 11th grade. But I think you get the gist, right? Like it's just people are in the wrong place. And too many of these people are in this place where they're not supposed to be, not enough are in this other place doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing. So how do we treat that? Well, the pharmaceutical companies would have you believe that you come in and you give more antibiotics, right? And when you just think about it from a very basic common sense perspective, it does not make sense that something that is caused by too many antibiotics typically is going to be fixed by an antibiotic. So the antibiotic that I'm talking about is rifaximin. It's marketed as Xifaxan, and it is, an FDA-approved drug for treatment of this. That came later. It was originally for traveler's diarrhea, and it's supposed to selectively just kill off the problematic bacteria in the small intestine. But of course, that's magical thinking, because what it does is it removes wide swaths of bacteria in the gut. And so I would say probably 4 out of every 5 people I see with SIBO have been treated by somebody else, not by me, with this antibiotic. And not just treated once, treated often 3 or 4 or 5 times. And I kind of want to say to them, if it's not working, doing it again is usually not going to solve the problem. And the thing is, it does work initially, because when your gut is sort of sterilized, when you remove so much of the bacteria, you feel great. But the problem is, as you start to get regrowth, which you have to, right? You have to have bacteria in your gut to function. You start to see exponential, this gradient being even more messed up, because as luck would have it, the more essential bacteria tend to be the more fragile ones and the ones that are more susceptible to the antibiotics. So now you get overgrowth and you have more of the problematic Clostridial species and the staph species and maybe some yeast species, et cetera. So you have even more imbalance. And so that's why it's a very short-sighted fix. And people will say, oh, I feel great, my bloating is better and so on. And then they'll come back a month later, 6 weeks later, 2 months later and say, oh, yeah, not so good. So the thing that I want you to remember with SIBO is I want you to think of imbalance and disruption, not you have too much bacteria and you have to kill them off. Okay, I think that's really important. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause for questions here, and then I want to get into treatment. Okay, let's see. All right. Having had ulcerative colitis and SIBO symptoms for over 2 decades, I'm curious about how to navigate the diet for both of these. Thank you, sir. I'm going to get right into that. Nothing has ever improved my bloating except not eating, which clearly is unsustainable. And you are right about that. What would you suggest to someone who just had a colonoscopy that was great, but still experiencing soft stool and discomfort in the stomach? I'm thinking I might have SIBO. I'm going to get back to you on that. And I'm glad the colonoscopy was great. Does cholestyramine affect motility? That's a quick one I can answer for you, Robin. Absolutely, it does. So cholestyramine binds those bile salts, which can be helpful in people who have had bowel resections or their gallbladder out because they usually have excess bile salts, but it does create constipation and slows down motility. So you have to kind of titrate it, right? Enough that you're not having diarrhea, but not so much that you're bloated and uncomfortable. Endurance sports, despite my UC struggles. Go, Jason. What do you recommend for sports drinks, energy drinks, etc.? Yes, I'm so glad. So I'm going to come to these 3. Sarah's question about UC and SIBO, the colonoscopy, and the energy drinks, because most of them are terrible, right? And then we'll get back to the other questions. So those 3. So Sarah, in terms of ulcerative colitis and SIBO, remember that SIBO or dysbiosis can be foundational to a lot of these autoimmune diseases, right? So it's not surprising that you have SIBO and colitis, because not every autoimmune disease, but particularly the gut-based ones, if we do really detailed microbiome analysis in patients with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, we see that a huge majority of them do have disruption in the microbiome. And we feel like this is part of what is at the root cause of their disease. And so a lot of our efforts in my practice have to do with correcting this microbial imbalance. So that's not surprising. This is a problem that a lot of people face. The foods that we know are restorative for the microbiome, which are the high fiber foods. So, not just cruciferous vegetables like kale and broccoli, et cetera, but also things like sweet potato and squash. So all the stuff with the fiber in it, the stuff that has a lot of inulin in it, like oats and dandelion greens, artichokes, et cetera, all very good. If you have active ulcerative colitis and inflammation, you may not tolerate those foods because they're high roughage foods and they can sometimes be irritating to the lining of the gut. So what you sometimes have to do is sort of slowly ease into them and do more blended stuff. I'm doing a split pea soup now that might even be too much roughage for you. So something like a butternut squash soup, a little bit smoother fiber, you have to ease into it. And as things gradually heal in terms of the ulceration and the inflammation, you should be able to tolerate more. And then as you ramp up to higher levels, the goal is that as a microbiome gets restored and repaired, the inflammation stays under control because now your immune system is healthier, right? But that can be a tricky process to navigate. And that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing in the drug-free IBD course. And I know you're signed up for that. And I'm so thrilled to see you there. Okay, let's talk about the colonoscopy. And Lee, I'm going to get back to you. Let's talk about the colonoscopy question. I think I mentioned this either last week or the week before, that they did a study and they looked at the bowel prep for colonoscopy. And this is a specific bowel prep, but they're all sort of ballpark. And they found that the microbiome was disrupted for about 2 weeks. Now, most people didn't have symptoms. They didn't have the soft stool that you were describing or bloating or anything like that, but many people do. And I find that people who describe the worst kind of post-colonoscopy prep symptoms are generally my IBD patients. They'll say, oh, I feel flared up. And so if you're having a little bit of soft stool, it may be that the prep is still making its way through your digestive tract and you're experiencing that, or it may be that you have a little microbial disruption. And what I would recommend is adding in some fermented foods, some sauerkraut, some kimchi. I'm not a huge fan of kimchi, but I like a kraut and apple sauerkraut. So you have like a green apple in for some crispness. Don't get the stuff from the supermarket. Try and get something from the farmer's market that has a little more probiotic punch to it in terms of not being pasteurized, et cetera. So, or make some yourself at home. There's a gazillion different websites, book sources, YouTube videos on fermenting. It's pretty simple. So some fermented foods, if you feel like a few days go by and you're not getting back to where you need to be, that would be really helpful. The question about the sports drinks, I am known at my daughter's sports activities for being the one who comes in and like, why are you drinking this nonsense? It's full of high fructose corn syrup and chemicals. And the truth is, for most of us, I mean, maybe if you're getting ready to do an Ironman triathlon and, you know, swim 2.6 miles and bike 112 miles and run 26.2 miles, I think that's swim 2.4 actually, maybe, but the truth is most of us are not anywhere near approaching electrolyte depletion from the level of exercise we're doing. So the sports drinks are really sugary. Anything with artificial sweetener is out. We talked about that last time because the artificial sweeteners really mess up your microbiome. They create incredible disruption and imbalance. So anything, and that's not necessarily just like saccharin, but any of the oses, so maltose, sucrose, maltose, those things are poorly absorbed carbohydrate sweeteners, and they end up really messing things up. And just the amount, the sugar content, and unlike, you know, you could be eating a piece of fruit like an apple or a mango that has a lot of sugar in it, but that sugar is surrounded by fiber, and the fiber is going to slow down the absorption of the sugar, so you don't get a big insulin spike. But with a liquid sports drink like that, with a high sugar content, that sugar is going straight into your gut, getting digested, and it's really sort of wreaking havoc a little bit in your microbiome, not to mention the chemicals. And, you know, I'm sure you're not talking about soda, but I talked about this in a post the other day, that the average soda is 150 calories times 365 days is 54,750 calories, divided by 3,500 calories is a pound, is 15.6 pounds in a year from just drinking one soda. But let's say you're not drinking a soda. Let's say you're drinking a Gatorade, which is probably about the same 150 calories, 15.5 pounds in a year from one of these sports drinks a day. And if you're drinking a 0-calorie one, you're really in trouble because, again, then you're using the artificial sweetener that's messing up your microbiome. So water is great if you're really dehydrated. And I use this as rehydration therapy for my patients with inflammatory bowel disease. Sometimes I'll use coconut water. And, you know, just a brand like Harmless Harvest or Vita Coco that doesn't have any added flavoring, sugar, anything. I got one the other day. Somebody, a mom from school, gave me this case of coconut water. She's like, I hear you drink this stuff, and we bought it and didn't like it. But it was coconut water from Costco and it had added sugar. And I thought, why are you adding sugar to something that's already sweet? So I appreciated the gesture, but I didn't want to have the coconut water with the added sugar. Okay, let's make sure I answered your question, Jason. Okay, yeah, maltodextrin, fructose, definitely no-nos under SCD and really just for anybody. Okay, so what I would do instead of a gel, I would do a nut butter. And actually I did this for the Philadelphia half marathon I ran the week before Thanksgiving, is I did some almond butter. And that was great. I did do a little bit of dark chocolate too, but 80% for the race. But a nut butter is a great way to do that. And then just drink water. You really, you know, you don't, if you want to put a dash of salt in it, if you feel like you really, you know, need the repleting, that's fine. But, you know, try and do like nuts, maybe a little bit of fruit or something, and just some water, and that should take you through. Okay. What symptoms indicate SIBO? Oh, Stephen, thank you very much for that. Okay. What symptoms indicate SIBO? Wide range of symptoms, but the most common from a GI point of view are bloating and abdominal discomfort. Some people have constipation. The classic definition really talks about diarrhea, but most people I find have more constipation than bloating, but it's really bloating, have more constipation than diarrhea. It's really bloating, abdominal discomfort, and a change in bowel habits. Now, if you look at most reference sources, including my book, you'll see a long list of symptoms that include fatigue, you know, yeast overgrowth, insomnia, rashes, all kinds of things. And these things can be manifestations of a disrupted microbiome. Just like, you know, we talked about a disrupted microbiome being foundational for disorders like Crohn's disease, celiac disease, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's behind your symptoms. If you're tired or you have joint aches or rashes, it could be SIBO, but it could be something else. So it's important to not, you know, these are non-specific symptoms. And it's important to really look at the whole constellation. Okay. VSL3 versus Visbiome from Stephen, and you're so very welcome for that, Stephen. Visbiome, and I am not promotional. I have zero relationships with any company that sell anything at all. But this is just a sort of factual thing I want to tell you. VSL number 3 was an original product of probiotics. It was a sort of particular recipe, if you will, that was created by Dr. DeSimone, the DeSimone formulation. And it was licensed as VSL number 3. That license agreement ended, and Claudio DeSimone, took his original formulation of the specific several different bacterial strains and created a company called Visbiome. So all those dozens and dozens of studies using VSL that were really done with the original DeSimone formulation that is now Visbiome. And then VSL went and created their own formulation. So that happened several years ago. There was a big lawsuit involved that Visbiome won. Without getting into too many details, the Visbiome product is the old VSL, is the original DeSimone formulation, the one that all the studies were done on in IBS and pouchitis, et cetera. So that is the one that I use. Are any of the tests for SIBO valid? Carolyn, that's such a good question, because I'll tell you, if I round up randomly 100 people right now in DC and line them up against a wall and do a SIBO test on them, guess how many are going to have a positive test? Asymptomatic people just walking around, minding their own business before I line them up to do a SIBO test on them. About 30, depending on what studies you read, anywhere from 11 to 30% of asymptomatic people will have a positive SIBO test. So I want you, we are all in a state of dysbiosis to some extent, right? If you live in the modern world and you eat any sort of processed food and you don't, you're not spending all your time outside and you've taken medications, et cetera, there is some element of disruption that's going on. But when it gets to be severe, at a certain threshold, this is when we can start to see it interfering with our body's physiology and maybe even manifesting not just as symptoms, but as actual diseases. Okay, so that is a threshold. It's a gradient from, you have a little bit of disruption because you took some antibiotics, you're not eating that well, to you took a year of doxycycline for acne, you're eating packaged foods, you're not moving, et cetera, and you're now having symptoms. And from that and now you've been diagnosed with an actual disease. So the breath test, the Genova breath test for SIBO, is one that I've used in my office for years. And there's sort of a methane predominant and hydrogen predominant. And it's okay, but none of these tests are really a slam dunk. Sometimes I'll do the test because I think it's important for the person, for their own validation, to see what's going on. Sometimes I want to follow what's going on if they're not getting better, but they're not great tests. They're not super reliable. You can do it one day and it's positive and another day it's negative. If they're constipated, that can mess it up. If they're taking any kind of acid block or any drug that interferes with motility, it can mess it up. So there are just so many variables to the test that there's not like a really high sensitivity, high specificity test for it. Okay, in the old days, we would do jejunal aspirates where we put a long scope down, suck out some of the fluid from your jejunum, analyze it. Nobody does that outside of a laboratory setting anymore. Readenoma and duodenum, or any foods would be, okay. Marilyn, that's a great question, but a little far afield from SIBO. So I'm going to try and get back to you at the end. Is it due to constant eating? Can it be controlled by diet? SIBO? Well, it depends, Gopi, on what you're eating. I mean, if your constant eating is like a whole bunch of sugar and processed food and you're feeding the wrong bacteria, that can cause disruption. And your question about diet, I mean, I get a lot of questions about intermittent fasting for different GI conditions. Intermittent fasting alone is generally not a solution to SIBO. But if your SIBO manifests as constipation and bloating and discomfort, having periods of fasting where you allow the GI tract to rest and things to sort of make their way through can be helpful, at least symptomatically. Okay. Lee wants to know, will people be positive for only hydrogen or methane too? It can be either. What we see is that methane predominant, a methane level over 10, 11, generally predicts constipation. Not always, But I really like seeing that correlation. Like when somebody comes in and I get their SIBO test and look at the methane level, I always go back to their chart and see, were they complaining of constipation? Because we find the high methane predominant tests tend to trend more towards constipation, but not always. And people can be positive for one or the other. And depending on the test, there are different thresholds, different levels above, maybe above 20 for the hydrogen, above 10 for the methane. Has to be both. So that depends on the particular test. Yes, this will be posted later. I'm so sorry about your mother. Okay. Somebody says they take esomeprazole, which is a proton pump inhibitor, daily because of severe GERD. What can you substitute for it? Because you really don't like taking it due to its side effects. Well, I don't blame you. And let me just remind everybody, I know you know this. I'm not your doctor. I'm not giving you medical advice. We're having an educational discussion. I would really, at a BC, I would really talk to whoever's prescribing it or recommending it, if you're taking an over-the-counter form, about something else. In terms of side effects, the H2 blockers, Pepcid in particular, has a better side effect profile. Tums is a better side effect profile. But what would be ideal is if you could identify what is driving the reflux. Are you eating too much? Are you eating too late? Are you eating too high fat? Are you having too much dairy? What's going on? Why you're having the reflux so you can get off the drug completely. And we talked about that an office hours or two ago. It should be posted, the one on PPIs and reflux and COVID. Okay. Let's see what else we have in the chat. How to treat watery stool. If the watery stool is from SIBO, you treat the SIBO, but if you're just having watery stool and you don't know what it's from, you need to evaluate that. And that evaluation usually starts with a stool analysis, sending the stool off to look for white blood cells in it to see if there's an inflammatory process going on, looking for ova, which are eggs of parasites, and doing a bacterial culture. So that's a general sort of diarrhea 101, is doing a stool analysis, first of all. And then you have to look at, again, is it something in the medicine cabinet you're taking that's causing diarrhea? Is it an inflammatory process, et cetera? So that's a little more involved than necessarily just treating SIBO. Yeah, hi, Natalie. Maybe caused by your issues and the cholestid. Yeah, the cholestid is a kind of a double-edged sword, right? It can be really helpful. For those of you who don't know, cholestid is a brand of cholestyramine, which is a bile salt binder. Bile is actually made in the liver and it's stored in the gallbladder. And then it's released by the gallbladder through the bile ducts into the small intestine in response to fat in the digestive tract, because it helps to, the bile salts help to emulsify the fat, kind of like when you have grease on a plate and you put dishwashing liquid on it and then now you can wash the grease off. That's what the bile salts help with, emulsifying the fat so they can be absorbed through the lining of the small intestine. If you don't have a gallbladder, if your gallbladder was removed, then your bile is in continuous circulation from your liver to your GI tract, and it can cause what's called a bile salt diarrhea. We call it a choloretic diarrhea. And this medication, cholestyramine, cholestid, can help to bind the bile salts so you don't have diarrhea. But in that binding, they can create constipation. They can slow down motility. So again, Natalie, it's a little bit of a balance. Okay. My thoughts about the breath test is that they can be helpful. They're usually not a slam dunk, but when I'm looking at a breath test, I'm not looking at it in isolation. I'm looking at it with the person's clinical history, starting with their medication history. I'm looking at it in the context of what other medical conditions do they have? What are their symptoms? So I never completely rest the diagnosis of SIBO just on the breath test. The GI map test, I don't think is a very helpful test, and I'll just leave it there. It measures a lot of different things. I don't think it measures any of them well or precisely. And a lot of the things they're measuring, we don't have good validated, normal ranges really identified. And we're not even sure what some of those things are that they're measuring, if they're if they're useful or valid at all. And I'll tell you that I probably looked at thousands of GI map tests in my practice, and I don't think I've ever seen a normal one. And that should tell you something, right? A test where everybody is always abnormal on something. So I find that a lot of this testing ends up being just a portal for folks to prescribe you a bunch of supplements. So that's my 2 cents. Can you have a positive methane breath test without SIBO? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. So for example, if you're constipated, if you just happen to have the breath test on a day when you're constipated, it could give you a positive test. So you can see false positives and you can see false negatives. Is organic stevia okay? Lee, just use some sugar. Just use some sugar. Forget about the artificial sweeteners. I don't think we really have time to get into lectins here. Recommended treatment for methane positive SIBO and thoughts on taking a magnesium supplement. And we have some other really good questions here, but this is a great time to talk about what is my approach to treating SIBO. So we're sort of understanding SIBO, right? It's not just you have too much bacteria in the small intestine and you just whip out some Xifaxan and take it and presto, you're new again. Wish that were the case, typically not how it works. So I really like to focus on this concept of remove, replace, restore. Very simple. Remove might be the most important part of that triad. What are the things that you are doing that are potentially contributing to this problem, right? So of course, we start in the medicine cabinet. Antibiotics, acid blockers, steroids, things that slow down motility, things that are constipating, etc. Even thyroid medication can contribute if you have hyperthyroidism and you're taking something for that. So look at the medicine cabinet, do your research. It's not like there's going to be a warning label on the medication saying, warning, this medication causes SIBO. That's typically not what we're dealing with. So you're going to have to do some research, but think about things that are either killing off microbes or interfering with motility or changing the pH. Okay. So with the remove, look at the medicine cabinet, look at practices. Are you, again, too sedentary? Are you not moving? There's no peristalsis. Look at what you're eating. Are you eating a lot of artificial sweeteners? Are you eating a lot of very sugary foods that are feeding the wrong bacteria? Are you not eating enough fiber? So what are you doing that you could change in terms of the remove? The replace, there can be a role for probiotics, but that replace, in my mind, what works really well is the fermented foods. Right? So that's typical of the replace I'm suggesting to patients. In my practice, depending on what the background noise is with the SIBO, I see a lot of patients with inflammatory bowel disease. I love taking care of patients with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And in those patients, we have very good scientific clinical data that shows that products like some of these probiotics at high doses can be really helpful. And so I will frequently use them at a prescription strength in addition to the diet and getting people on more fermented foods, et cetera, in terms of the replace. And, you know, replace is also soil microbes, right? Get outside in nature, because that's another way you can replenish your microbes. And then the third, how do you really restore the health of the gut? You restore the health of the gut by nourishing it with food. You don't nourish it with a supplement that you bought in a canister from GNC. That is not nourishing for the gut. So you really have to think about the foods. And, you know, sometimes a nourishment is just having something that's a little more gentle, like a bone broth type thing, because your gut is inflamed, whether you have colitis or you just have bad SIBO. So sometimes it means just going to something easier tolerated, right? So sort of soup smoothie type thing. But really, when I'm talking about restoring, I'm talking about ultimately building up the amount of plant-based fiber in your gut. So why do I just constantly harp on this? Because it works. I promise you that if there were some magical supplement out there that I could direct you to take that would fix this problem, I would tell you about it. I promise you. I harp on the diet and the food because that is what gets people to the finish line with real and lasting relief. Remember, when we talk about the microbiome, we're talking about living organisms. We're talking about the little zoo inside you. And so what you feed them is paramount. And speaking of zoos, I actually live so close to the National Zoo that I can sometimes hear the lions roaring. And it makes me sad because it sounds like they're crying because they're in these enclosures and they're eating, you know, food that is probably completely foreign to them. And this is why animals in zoos typically die and they stop reproducing. Because when you take them out of their natural habitat, and no matter how you try and, you know, plant the trees and make it look like they're in the savannas, they're not, and they know they're not. And I think microbially, they know they're not. And so it's the same thing when we are living in a very unnatural habitat, when we're eating food that is coming from a factory rather than from the farm and from the ground, and we're living inside all the time and we're not moving and we're living these on natural lifestyles and eating this on natural food, the same thing happens, right? Our microbes really, that whole incredibly important ecosystem within us gets disrupted, and it leads to symptoms, and then it leads to disease, etc. So we have to really think about, I always talk about how can you rewild yourself? And I joke that like, oh, I didn't bathe for 3 days and yeah. But that's not really what I'm talking about when I refer to rewilding. What I'm really talking about is restoring the health and the balance of the microbiome in your gut. And that is, again, the remove, replace, restore. What are you doing? If you're taking something you bought on the internet and whatever, unless you feel that this thing is making a significant difference, there is a pretty high possibility it is disrupting your microbiome, because all of these things have fillers and emulsifiers and all sorts of stuff in them. So again, instead of taking a turmeric capsule, go put some turmeric in your soup, the actual spice, right? Where you don't have to worry about the lecithins and all the other things that may be coming with it. Okay, let's get back to some questions. Somebody tested positive for SIBO with a breath test, went on PPIs, but I think SIBO was either created by being on PPIs or exacerbated. You are 100% right, Jean. PPIs are one of the main contributors to SIBO, just like antibiotics, because of that change in pH. So hopefully you have figured out a way to get off the PPI, and you don't necessarily need to retest for the breath test. You can also go based on symptoms. Okay, so methane is a gas that is produced. When bacteria ferment products, they produce different metabolites. And we talked about short-chain fatty acids, but methane is also something that gut bacteria produce. Hydrogen, methane, they produce these gases. And so when they're measuring the methane, they're indirectly measuring the bacteria in the small intestine, Elizabeth, by measuring the metabolic product, the methane. And so when you see above a certain level, it means you have overrepresentation of bacteria in that area. Being treated by a naturopath, I've taken herbs, rifaximin twice now and more herbs. Should I stop? Chloe, the question is, are you feeling better? If it's working. If it's working, if it's not working, and so if you're being treated a second time with rifaximin, that suggests to me that the first time did not work. And I would definitely not be going for another round of something that didn't work, because it's going to not work again. Okay. And with the herbs, there's stuff that I don't know, but maybe there are herbs that are helpful, but you want to know what stuff is. And the minimum bar is, show me a study, tell me what's in these herbs, and show me a study that shows this was effective. Because I can quote you and show you dozens of studies that show how changing the diet improves the microbiome. One of the most famous ones was one that showed 31 different plants a week led to significant change in the microbiome. So it's got to be evidence-based, right? It can't be just somebody selling you some herbs. You have no idea what's in them. So I would ask them, I need to know what's in this and show me the data. Can you guide me to some scientific studies? Low FODMAP diet. We're going to do a whole one, Joanne, on low FODMAP diet. It was a diet that was really designed as a diagnostic diet for irritable bowel syndrome, that when you reduce the fermentable foods, you decrease the gas and distension, but it's really not a therapeutic diet. So even though removing those foods can make you feel better, and certainly some of them, like the dairy and the gluten and so on, you can keep them out. But removing some of the other high fiber foods, even though it decreases your gas, it also potentially means that you're not feeding the microbiome appropriately. So it's important to remember that FODMAP is not a therapeutic diet for SIBO. Okay. Gallbladder sludge is not a cause for SIBO. No. That was from Amanda. Regarding fiber, all the SIBO diets seem to be very low on fiber. That has always confused me. Yes, me too. Just like treating SIBO with antibiotics doesn't seem to make any sense. And I think why that is, Chloe, is because there's symptomatic treatment and there's therapeutic treatment. So if you're bloating and having a lot of abdominal distension and you decrease a lot of the fermentable foods, your abdominal distension and bloating will feel better. But when you decrease those fermentable foods, you're not feeding the healthy gut bacteria that you want to increase to rebalance your microbiome, if that makes sense, right? So it's sort of this gas break thing that you have to gradually increase these amounts. And, understand that there likely is going to be some discomfort, some gas. I was at the DuPont Circle Farmers Market on Sunday, as I am most Sundays, and bought a big thing of Brussels sprouts and baby potatoes and carrots and came home and roasted them. And yeah, there was gas, a lot of gas from those Brussels sprouts, but that's par for the course. But I also know that Brussels sprouts are amazing in terms of feeding gut bacteria. So, now I wasn't having any pain or anything. If you have a condition where you're having painful gas, you may have to rethink it. But I want you to remember that just the presence of gas doesn't necessarily mean something bad is going on. Sometimes it means something amazing is going on. Your gut bacteria are fermenting high fiber foods and creating helpful short chain fatty acids for you. Okay, very curious what you think about taking a magnesium supplement. It is the only thing that has worked for my gut problems thus far. So magnesium, I use a lot of magnesium in my practice as a cathartic, as a pro-motility agent, and ginger works well too. But different forms of magnesium, again, I have no relationship with any of these companies. There's a product called Oxy Powder Magnesium that works really well for my patients with constipation. I'll usually have them pair it with a little psyllium husk fiber or acacia fiber in the morning and a little Oxy Powder Magnesium in the evening at night. It works really well. It can work too well. It can give some people cramping, but in general, Emma, magnesium is a safe supplement to take for most people. And the reason it's probably helping your gut is it's probably helping to move things out a little more robustly. So I'm glad that's working. Okay. Yeah, this SCAD is not typically a result of colitis or SIBO. And that was, to really get into that. I'll tell you what, Naomi, fill out the survey and recommend that as a future one, and we can get into it. How to naturally increase stomach acid levels? Well, the best way to increase stomach acid levels is if you're taking something to block acid to stop it. Beyond that, you don't necessarily want to have more acid than normal. More acid than normal is a condition called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which is actually a really rare condition. It's only about 1 per million people. So maybe 300 people in the US have it. And it's a hyperproduction of acid, and it's associated with a lot of problems. So you don't want to have more acid than normal. What you want to have is adequate acid levels. And in the absence of blocking stomach acid, that should be the case, because there are very few conditions that cause low acid. Low acid is generally created by medications. True hypochlorhydria or achlorhydria, which is lack of acid, we can see in certain medical conditions like pernicious anemia, et cetera. But outside of these medical conditions, that's pretty rare. Okay. What about Align as a probiotic? Align is a probiotic that contains one species in not particularly high levels. And I know the product well because I was doing some advising with P&G many moons ago in a former life when I did some of that stuff and helped them with the launch. So the studies with Align show that it increased gut motility through the sigmoid colon a little bit. And that's the same of some of the bacteria that are in products like some of the probiotic yogurts that people have. But Align is not typically going to move the needle if you are treating something like SIBO. Okay. On PPIs from April to October, finally got off, yay. Still having some challenges with loose stool, which we know the PPIs can cause, and rumbly belly. Upping your fiber, great. Still have some challenges. Also started the Visbline probiotic. What else can I do to calm my gut and firm my stools? Well, again, you really, Jean, you want to make sure that the loose stools are not from something else, right? So sorry, there's lots of sun coming in here at this time of day. So you probably want to do some stool testing to make sure that, there's not a parasite or infection or something with the loose stools. Look at the medicine cabinet, do all of those things. If you do a good evaluation for the loose stools, there is something called bentonite clay, which can bind up some of the liquid in stools and can be a pretty benign way to treat loose stools. I've used it in some of my patients. You have to be careful though, because the bentonite clay can also bind medications if you're taking anything, and it can also bind some of the nutrients. So you don't want to use this for long term, but it can help to thicken it. Oatmeal can be a great stool thickener. A lot of my colitis patients swear by oatmeal in the morning. And the other thing, something we think of as a product for constipation, psyllium husk. So we think of stuff like Metamucil and psyllium as something you take if you're constipated, but psyllium can also help bind looser stool together, particularly if you're having multiple looser stools. So it can work the other way too. So those would be some things to try: bentonite clay, oatmeal, and psyllium husk. Okay. Let's see what else we have. I'm going to go back to questions. We have Q&A and chat. Lots of problems with bloating, abdominal distension, can't find any cause, very active, mostly whole food, plant-based diet for years, food from your own garden, that's so awesome. Haven't had a lot of antibiotic exposure, no acid reducers or NSAIDs, negative yearly fit test, normally, Can this be SIBO? Yeah, it could be, but I agree with you, Carolyn. I don't know why you would have it either. One thing that maybe helps, so Carolyn is basically saying she's been having a lot of GI issues, and she just doesn't have that classic history of somebody who'd be having SIBO. What may be helpful, Carolyn, is just to do a typical elimination diet, right? Just, I mean, there are multiple variations and ways you can do it. But take everything out and start with, usually most of them will have you do something very basic like turkey and rice and like one vegetable, and then gradually increase. In my first book, Gut Bliss, I talk about the SAD gas elimination diet. So SAD is sugar, artificial sweeteners, dairy, gas is gluten, alcohol, sugar, and removing SAD gas, all SAD gas, food and drink for a few weeks, and then gradually, adding them in. But it looks like you're already eliminating a lot of those foods. So you may need to go beyond SAD gas and do like a complete elimination diet and see, because one thought is that it may be something food-wise that you were eating or drinking. The other thing to think about is beyond the GI tract. Is there something potentially going on from a GYN point of view? Do you have fibroids? Do you have endometriosis? Do you have an anteverted or a retroverted uterus? So sometimes we have to cast a broader net than just the GI tract. And, in my patients, when they really had persistent GI symptoms and I really can't find a cause and they're doing everything right, sometimes I'll think about doing a little bit of imaging then, maybe just starting with an ultrasound to see what's going on. So talk to, whoever's providing your care and see if you guys can come up with a plan to figure that out. And I wish you a lot of luck with that. Started a keto diet last March to try and get my diabetes under control. Yes, gut and bowels have not been the same. I know. And you also don't have a gallbladder. Oh my goodness. Not a great idea. You're right, because keto is kind of starving your gut microbes, right? It's generally not enough carbohydrates in that carb allowance to be able to get in enough of those really fibrous foods. So I would think about modifying it. And I know it can be helpful for the blood sugar. And I just applaud you for exploring this idea of food as medicine, right? And there's no wrong or right path necessarily, just the best path for you. But if your gut and your bowels are giving you some really important feedback, I would heed that advice. So I would think about modifying your keto with adding in a little more complex carbs, maybe a little more squash, sweet potato, maybe some legumes, which I know are forbidden on keto, but that might be, lentils, split peas, maybe not black beans, chickpeas, but lentils and split peas may help get you to the finish line. Maybe a little quinoa, maybe a little brown rice, maybe a little oatmeal, just small amounts of that, and see, when these low carb diets like keto and paleo and, South Beach and Atkins first became popular a few decades ago, we saw sales for psyllium husks soaring, right, for fiber, because everybody was constipated. So I hope that works out for you. A good way to introduce foods that have been tolerant to, like legumes, cruciferous veggies, garlic, onion, lots of other foods. Been plant-based for years, minimal sugar, and suffered with bad bloating and constipation. So slowly is my first piece of advice, and cooked is my second piece of advice initially. Raw vegetables are amazing and the most nutrient dense way to eat them. But for some of these foods, you probably have to cook them and cook them well. Sometimes adding a little bit of something like kombu, sea vegetable, helps with the gas. And of course, soaking stuff, if you're having any kinds of bean, legumes, soaking it overnight really helps with that. And then the other thing is just plain old Beano, right? Which is an enzyme, alpha-1 galactosidase, that we lack. That can also help with the process. So I hope some of those things are helpful for you. Are yeast infections affected by diet? Yes, 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 Robin. If you have a yeast infection and you are eating a starchy, even if it's not a sugary diet, you don't have to be eating Malamars. But if you are eating a lot of bread, a lot of rice, a lot of pasta, that is clearly going to be feeding the yeast species. So you want to try and think about eating more vegetables and having your sugar more in the form of fruit, whole fruit, as opposed to processed carbs. Thank you, Maria. I really appreciate that. I really enjoy sharing with you guys. Yeah, the almond, Marilyn has a great question about the yogurts for probiotics. There's really not enough live bacteria in those pasteurized yogurt products to really move the needle much. So, you know, if you like them and they don't have a lot of objectionable ingredients, I think that's fine. But the idea that you're going to fix a SIBO with yogurt is very unlikely. Again, fermented foods. Get thee to a farmer's market close to you and get some sauerkraut. I promise you, good things will happen. And you know, even there've been studies that show even an apple that is grown in a local orchard, I forget what the study, whether it was 30 miles or 50 miles from where you live without pesticides, has an enormous microbial load, more than the average probiotic you're taking from the supermarket. Okay, what I think we have a minute left. So let's see what else we have. We have such good questions, you guys. Thank you so much. Thyroid is underactive, so I'm prescribed thyroxine. That seems essential. What can I do? Yeah, if your thyroid is truly underactive, if you truly have hypothyroidism, and you need it, you know, just make sure it was done with a reputable thyroid test. It wasn't done with one of these tests where nobody ever has a normal test. And you know, the gut thyroid connection is really fascinating. And one of my dear friends and medical colleagues is Aviva Ram, who some of you may know. She's written some great books, Adrenal Thyroid Revolution, etc. And she has some great courses. And I think what I'll do for the new year is I'll get Aviva on to co-host an office hours with me, and we'll talk all about the thyroid and the gut. I think that should be the plan. And if you're interested, again, fill out the survey and say, yes, you want Aviva and gut thyroid. She's absolutely fantastic. So I think it's 1 o'clock. So I think we're going to have to end it here. But thank you all so much. It's so awesome being with you. Next Tuesday, we are doing, let me check. I think it's getting regular, but I don't want to misspeak. Yeah, getting regular. So bring all your constipation questions, any product questions, anything you want to know about constipation, bloating, and getting regular. The 28th was supposed to be belly fat versus bloated, but I am going to be away. So we have moved that to January 4th. So please do go ahead and sign up. And I hope to be with lots of you next week for getting regular. All right. Until then, take care. Have a great week. Bye-bye.